The sunlight streamed through the window of the modest house Gabrielle now called home, a far cry from the grandeur she had envisioned when she married Thomas. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the air as she sat at the kitchen table, her manicured nails tapping against the cheap laminate surface. Across from her, Thomas buried his face in his hands, his once pristine suit rumpled and careworn. "It's all gone," Thomas muttered, his voice breaking. "The contracts, the clients, everything. The company can't recover." Gabrielle's eyes narrowed, her sharp features tense. This wasn't the life she had signed up for. She'd married into the Belrose family for its wealth, not for this pathetic scene of failure. Suppressing her growing irritation, she placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, feigning compassion. "We'll figure it out," she said softly, though her mind was already racing. "We still have the house." Thomas shook his head. "The house is under my mother's name. It was never part of the business." Gabrielle's mouth tightened. Odette, always so regal in her 70s, had made it clear she never fully trusted her daughter-in-law. Now, Odette's name on the deed was a barrier to Gabrielle's survival plan. "That's unfortunate," Gabrielle murmured, masking her true thoughts. "But we're family. I'm sure she'll support us." Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "You don't know my mother. She's proud, Gabrielle. She won't just hand over the house, especially not now." Gabrielle forced a smile, but inside, her frustration simmered. If Odette wouldn't give them the house willingly, Gabrielle would have to find another way. Later that evening, as the house settled into an uneasy silence, Gabrielle wandered into the living room. The faint hum of a clock filled the air. Odette sat in her favorite armchair, knitting calmly as though the world hadn't just come crashing down around them. Gabrielle perched on the edge of the couch, her lips curving into a practiced smile. "Odette, I wanted to thank you for being so supportive during this difficult time." Odette didn't look up from her knitting. "Family stands together in hard times," she replied evenly, her tone non-committal. "I've been thinking," Gabrielle continued, leaning forward slightly, "with Thomas so overwhelmed, maybe I could help manage some of the household finances. It might take some of the burden off your shoulders." Odette paused, her hands stilling. Her sharp eyes met Gabrielle's. "I appreciate the offer, Gabrielle, but I've been managing this household for decades. I think I can handle it." Gabrielle's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She quickly recovered, her voice soft and imploring. "Of course, I didn't mean to overstep. I just want to ensure we're all secure. You know, as a family." Odette's gaze didn't waver. "I understand, dear. But security comes from integrity and hard work, not schemes." The words landed with the weight of a warning, and Gabrielle's nails dug into the couch cushions. Odette's thinly veiled accusation was clear, and it stung more than Gabrielle wanted to admit. Late that night, Gabrielle paced the bedroom while Thomas snored softly. Her mind whirled with calculations and strategies. Odette was an obstacle, yes, but she wasn't invincible. Gabrielle had always prided herself on her ability to adapt, to seize opportunities others overlooked. In the dim glow of the bedside lamp, Gabrielle made her first call to Etienne. His smooth, deep voice answered on the other end, laced with intrigue. "It's late, Gabrielle," he murmured. "Trouble at home?" Gabrielle smirked, twisting a strand of her dark hair around her finger. "You could say that. I need your help." Etienne chuckled, the sound rich and dangerous. "I thought you'd never ask." As Gabrielle laid out her plan, the seeds of her scheme took root. Odette might have been formidable, but Gabrielle was determined to turn the situation to her advantage. After all, survival demanded sacrifice, and Gabrielle had no intention of being the one to lose. Gabrielle watched Odette move about the kitchen the next morning, her steps deliberate and confident despite her age. The older woman's hair was swept into a neat bun, and her sharp eyes darted toward Gabrielle as she poured herself a cup of tea. "Good morning," Odette said, her tone polite but distant. "Good morning," Gabrielle replied, forcing a cheerful tone. "You're up early?" Odette smiled faintly. "Old habits. Running this house has always kept me on a schedule." Gabrielle suppressed the urge to roll her eyes. Everything about Odette seemed like a veiled reminder of her authority over the home. Gabrielle was a guest here, a fact Odette made sure she never forgot. Later that day, Gabrielle found Thomas in the small office at the back of the house, his head buried in stacks of papers. His usually confident demeanor was replaced by slumped shoulders and dark circles under his eyes. "Thomas," Gabrielle said, leaning against the doorway, "you're wearing yourself out. Maybe it's time to let me help?" Thomas sighed, rubbing his temples. "Help with what, Gabrielle? There's nothing left to manage." Gabrielle stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "We can focus on the house. At least it's a place to rebuild. But we need to think long-term. Thomas shook his head. The house belongs to my mother. You know how she is. She's not going to hand over control no matter how much sense it makes. Gabrielle's expression softened into a practiced look of understanding. Maybe you're right. But if we can convince her it's for the good of the family, maybe she'll reconsider? Thomas hesitated, glancing at her. I don't know. Odette is stubborn, Gabrielle interrupted, laughing lightly to diffuse the tension. But she cares about you, Thomas. I'm sure she'll listen if we explain. He didn't respond, returning his gaze to the papers. Gabrielle's frustration simmered beneath the surface. Thomas's passivity was becoming another obstacle, and she couldn't afford to wait for him to take action. That evening, Odette joined them for dinner, her posture as upright as ever. Gabrielle noticed the way Odette's eyes lingered on her when she served Thomas, subtle but unmistakably scrutinizing. This stew is delicious, Gabrielle, Odette said, her tone polite yet distant. Thank you, Gabrielle replied with a sweet smile. I thought we could all use some comfort food. Odette set her spoon down carefully. Comfort is important, but so is practicality. Especially in times like these. Gabrielle bristled. Of course. That's why I've been thinking about ways to ensure we're all comfortable, secure even. Odette's brows arched. Oh? And what do you propose? Well, Gabrielle began, choosing her words carefully, if we work together, we could make some adjustments to how things are managed around here. For example, consolidating resources. Odette's eyes narrowed slightly, her expression still polite. Consolidating resources? Gabrielle pressed on, ignoring the warning in Odette's tone. Yes, to avoid unnecessary expenses. Maybe shifting some responsibilities to me so you can rest more. Odette leaned back in her chair, her gaze unflinching. I see. And would this consolidation involve changing the ownership of the house? The room fell silent. Thomas looked up from his plate, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. I didn't mean, Gabrielle began, but Odette raised a hand, silencing her. This house is my legacy, Odette said firmly. It has seen generations of our family, and I intend for it to remain a place of stability, not opportunism. Gabrielle's cheeks burned, but she managed to maintain her composure. Of course, Odette. I only meant to ease the burden on you. Odette smiled faintly, but the steel in her gaze was undeniable. I appreciate your concern, Gabrielle. But I'll handle my own burdens as I always have. That night, Gabrielle fumed in the solitude of her bedroom. Odette's calm yet cutting remarks replayed in her mind, each one a reminder of the older woman's unyielding position. If Odette wouldn't relinquish control willingly, Gabrielle would have to take matters into her own hands. She picked up her phone and dialed Etienne. He answered on the second ring, his voice smooth and amused. Back so soon? Etienne asked. I need your help, Gabrielle said, her tone sharp. Odette is resistant. Etienne chuckled. I expected nothing less. She's formidable, isn't she? Gabrielle's grip tightened on the phone. Formidable or not, she needs to be dealt with. Etienne's laughter softened, replaced by a more serious tone. Very well. Let's discuss this further, privately. Gabrielle agreed, setting the meeting for the next day. As she hung up, her resolve hardened. Odette might have been the matriarch of the Belrose family, but Gabrielle was determined to secure her future, at any cost. The air in Etienne's apartment was thick with the aroma of expensive cologne and red wine. Gabrielle perched on the edge of a sleek leather chair, her posture confident yet laced with tension. Across from her, Etienne lounged with an air of casual indifference, his dark eyes fixed on her as he swirled his wine. So, Etienne drawled, what's the next move in your little chess game? Gabrielle's lips curved into a faint smirk, though her fingers tapped nervously against the armrest. Odette isn't budging. She's made it clear the house will remain in her control. Etienne leaned forward, setting his glass down on the polished table. And you expected otherwise? I expected her to act in the family's best interest, Gabrielle snapped, her irritation slipping through. But she's too proud to admit that times have changed. Etienne studied her for a moment, a glint of amusement in his gaze. And by family's best interest, you mean your interest? Gabrielle's smirk deepened. It's the same thing. Etienne chuckled, shaking his head. You're as ambitious as ever. I admire that. But Odette isn't a woman to be trifled with. If you want to outmaneuver her, you'll need to be smarter. I don't need advice, Gabrielle retorted. I need action. Are you going to help me or not? Etienne rose from his seat and approached her, his presence looming. He tilted her chin up with a single finger, his voice dropping to a whisper. I'll help you, Gabrielle. But remember, nothing comes without a price. Gabrielle held his gaze, her confidence unwavering. I always pay my debts. Back at the Belrose house, the tension between Gabrielle and Odette grew thicker with each passing day. Thomas remained oblivious, consumed by his attempts to salvage what little remained of his family's business. Gabrielle, however, kept her composure, biding her time as she laid the groundwork for her plan. One evening, as Odette prepared tea in the kitchen, Gabrielle entered with a practiced smile. Odette, I thought we could talk. Odette glanced over her shoulder, her expression guarded. About what? Gabrielle took a seat at the small kitchen table, her tone light. About the future. I know you're protective of this house, but I think it's time we consider how to make it work for everyone. Odette placed the teapot on the counter and turned to face her. And by make it work, you mean giving you control? Gabrielle blinked, feigning surprise. I don't want control, Odette. I want stability for the family. Odette crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. This house has stood for decades without your input, Gabrielle. Stability isn't the issue here, it's trust. The words hit harder than Gabrielle expected, but she refused to let it show. I only want what's best for Thomas and for you. Odette tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. Then prove it. Gabrielle's breath hitched, but she quickly recovered, forcing a laugh. What do you mean? Actions speak louder than words, Odette said, her tone cool. If you truly care about this family, show me through your actions, not empty promises. As the days passed, Gabrielle's frustration grew. Odette was more perceptive than she had anticipated, and her subtle challenges only deepened Gabrielle's resolve. Meanwhile, her clandestine meetings with Etienne became increasingly frequent, their shared schemes solidifying into dangerous plans. One evening, Gabrielle met Etienne at a quiet cafe, far from the prying eyes of their suburban neighborhood. Etienne greeted her with a knowing smile, sliding a folder across the table. What's this? Gabrielle asked, opening the folder. Information, Etienne replied smoothly. Odette's finances, her connections, everything you need to leverage her position. Gabrielle's eyes scanned the documents, her heart racing. How did you get this? Etienne smirked. I have my ways. Consider it a gift. Gabrielle closed the folder, her mind whirring with possibilities. With this information, she could finally tilt the scales in her favor. This changes everything. Etienne leaned back, his grin widening. Just remember, Gabrielle, power is a dangerous game. Play it wisely. That night, as Gabrielle returned home, she noticed Odette in the living room, her sharp eyes watching an old film on the television. Gabrielle hesitated in the doorway, the weight of Etienne's folder in her bag suddenly feeling heavier. Late night? Odette asked, her tone casual but her gaze inquisitive. Just running errands, Gabrielle replied, forcing a smile. Odette nodded, her attention returning to the screen. It's good to be productive. Gabrielle made her way upstairs, her heart pounding. She knew she was walking a fine line, but the thought of failure wasn't an option. In her bedroom, she locked the door and spread the contents of the folder across the bed. As she studied the documents, a sense of satisfaction washed over her. Odette might have been a formidable opponent, but Gabrielle had always thrived under pressure. With Etienne's help, she was certain she could outmaneuver the older woman. Little did Gabrielle know, her actions were being watched more closely than she realized. Odette stood at the window, the early morning light casting a soft glow over her face. In her hand was a delicate china teacup, but her gaze was fixed on the driveway where Gabrielle's car had just disappeared. It wasn't unusual for Gabrielle to leave the house early, but the pattern of her absences had grown suspicious. Odette had lived long enough to recognize when someone was hiding something. Gabrielle's practiced smiles and overly sweet gestures were as thin as a sheet of glass. It was only a matter of time before they cracked. Later that day, Odette ventured into the kitchen to prepare lunch. She found Thomas seated at the table, staring absently at a stack of unpaid bills. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped under the weight of failure. Thomas, Odette said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. You've been working so hard. Take a break? He sighed and shook his head. I can't, Mother. Every day I feel like we're slipping further away from the life we had. Odette pulled out a chair and sat across from him. We're still a family, Thomas. That's what matters most. Thomas gave her a faint smile, but Odette could see the guilt in his eyes. She wanted to tell him the truth, that his wife's scheming went far beyond what he realized, but she hesitated. Without proof, it would only deepen the cracks in their fragile home. That evening, Gabrielle returned, her energy unusually high. She swept into the living room where Odette was knitting, her smile as sharp as ever. "Odette," Gabrielle began, sitting gracefully on the armrest of the couch, "I was thinking we could discuss some updates for the house. It could use a little modernization, don't you think?" Odette glanced up from her knitting, her expression calm but wary. "The house has stood the test of time without changes, Gabrielle. Why now?" Gabrielle's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Well, with everything going on, I thought it might lift everyone's spirits to make things brighter." Odette's hand stilled. "Brighter or easier for you to claim?" Gabrielle blinked, feigning confusion. "I don't know what you mean." Odette set her knitting aside and met Gabrielle's gaze, her voice steady. "I may be old, Gabrielle, but I'm not blind. I see what you're trying to do." Gabrielle's cheeks flushed, but she quickly masked her embarrassment with a chuckle. "You're imagining things, Odette. I only want to help." Odette leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Help yourself, you mean?" For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Gabrielle stood abruptly, smoothing her dress. "I think we've both had a long day. Good night, Odette." As Gabrielle left the room, Odette watched her retreating figure with a sinking feeling. Something was brewing, and if she didn't act soon, it could tear her family apart. Determined to uncover the truth, Odette began keeping a closer eye on Gabrielle. It wasn't long before she noticed patterns: early morning trips, late-night phone calls, and hushed conversations with Thomas that stopped the moment Odette entered the room. One afternoon, while Gabrielle was out, Odette found herself in the upstairs office. She hesitated at the desk, her fingers brushing against the scattered papers. It felt wrong to snoop, but her instincts urged her forward. Opening the desk drawer, she found a folder labeled in Gabrielle's handwriting. Inside were financial statements, property assessments, and notes about the house. Odette's stomach twisted as she read the carefully detailed plans for consolidating the property under Gabrielle's name. One phrase stood out, underlined and circled: "Thomas's approval is key." The sound of a car door slammed outside, jolting Odette from her thoughts. Quickly, she returned the folder to its place and left the office, her heart pounding. Gabrielle's scheming was more calculated than she had feared. That evening, Odette confronted Thomas as he sat in the living room, lost in thought. She held back her frustration, her voice gentle but firm. "Thomas, we need to talk about Gabrielle." Thomas looked up, frowning. "What about her?" Odette hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "She's planning something with the house. I've seen the evidence." Thomas shook his head, his expression clouding with doubt. "Mother, Gabrielle loves this family. She wouldn't do anything to hurt us." "I know you want to believe that," Odette said softly. "But love and ambition don't always go hand in hand." Thomas's frown deepened. "You don't trust her. You never have." Odette's heart ached at the hurt in his voice, but she refused to back down. "I only want to protect this family. Please, Thomas. Look into it yourself." Thomas sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know, Mother. I don't want to doubt her." Odette placed a hand on his. "Sometimes the hardest thing to do is see the truth about someone we love." Unbeknownst to Odette, Gabrielle had been listening from the hallway. Her hands clenched into fists as she retreated to the bedroom. Odette was becoming a problem Gabrielle couldn't afford to ignore. Gabrielle picked up her phone and dialed Etienne, her voice low and urgent. "We need to accelerate the plan. Odette is digging too deep." Etienne's chuckle sent chills down her spine. "Leave it to me, Gabrielle. She won't see it coming." As Gabrielle ended the call, her mind raced with possibilities. She had come too far to let an old woman ruin her plans. Odette would soon learn the price of standing in her way. The rain poured relentlessly, streaking the windows of the Belrose house. Odette sat in the living room, her knitting forgotten on her lap, as the distant sound of raised voices echoed through the house. Thomas and Gabrielle were arguing again, their strained relationship a storm brewing within the walls. "Your mother is impossible." Gabrielle's voice rang out from the kitchen. "She treats me like I'm some intruder." "She's my mother, Gabrielle," Thomas replied, his tone weary. "She's trying to protect what's left of our family. She's trying to control everything," Gabrielle shot back. "She's suffocating us, Thomas. We can't live like this forever." Odette's chest tightened as she listened. The cracks in the family were widening, and Gabrielle's influence over Thomas was growing more apparent by the day. Later that evening, Odette approached Thomas in the study. He sat with his head in his hands, the weight of the day pressing down on him. "Thomas," she began gently, "we need to talk." He looked up, his eyes tired. "Mother, not tonight." I can't handle another argument. This isn't an argument, Odette said firmly. It's about the house. About Gabrielle. Thomas's face darkened. You're obsessed with this. Why can't you give her a chance? Because she's not being honest with you, Odette said, her voice trembling. I've seen the documents, Thomas. She's planning to take the house. Thomas's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. And you went through her things? Do you even hear yourself? I did it to protect us, Odette said, her tone softening. Thomas, please look into it yourself. Thomas stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. I don't want to hear this anymore. Gabrielle is my wife and I trust her. I won't let you ruin what's left of this family. Odette opened her mouth to respond, but Thomas stormed out of the room, leaving her alone with the weight of her words. The next morning, Gabrielle's plan went into motion. She approached Thomas with tears in her eyes, her voice trembling with feigned vulnerability. Thomas, your mother? She doesn't trust me. She's trying to turn you against me. Thomas sighed, pulling her into his arms. I know, Gabrielle. She's just stubborn. Gabrielle leaned into him, her tears subsiding as a sly smile tugged at her lips. I can't live like this, Thomas. I love you, but I can't stay where I'm not wanted. What do you want me to do? Thomas asked, his voice heavy with resignation. Gabrielle hesitated, her expression shifting to one of calculated sadness. Maybe it's time for your mother to live somewhere else. Just until things settle down. Thomas frowned, his heart torn. She's my mother, Gabrielle. I can't just ask her to leave. I'm not asking, Gabrielle said softly. I'm begging. By the end of the week, Thomas approached Odette with the news. His face was pale, his voice trembling as he spoke. Mother, I think it's best if you take some time away from the house. Odette stared at him, her heart sinking. You're asking me to leave my home? Thomas hesitated, guilt clouding his features. Just for a little while. Gabrielle and I need space to work things out. This is my house, Thomas, Odette said, her voice shaking. Your father and I built this life for you. How can you let her do this? It's not like that, Thomas said weakly. Please, mother. Just trust me. Odette rose from her chair, her eyes filling with tears. Trust you? You've chosen her over me. Thomas looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Odette gathered her belongings in silence, her heart heavy as she prepared to leave the home she had cherished for decades. Odette stepped into the rain, her suitcase in hand. The door closed behind her, leaving her alone on the doorstep of an uncertain future. She walked to the bus stop, the cold seeping into her bones as she waited. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay. Hours later, Odette found herself at a local shelter. The volunteers welcomed her with warm smiles and hot tea, their kindness easing the ache in her chest. Among them was Simone, a spirited woman in her 50s who immediately took a liking to Odette. You're stronger than you look, Simone said, handing her a blanket. We'll figure this out. Odette nodded, her resolve strengthening. Gabrielle might have taken her home, but Odette wasn't defeated. She would find a way to reclaim what was hers. In the weeks that followed, Odette adjusted to life at the shelter. She befriended the other residents and began volunteering alongside Simone. It was through Simone that she first heard whispers about Etienne, a man with a reputation for shady dealings. Simone leaned in one evening, her voice low. I've seen Gabrielle meeting with him. If you want answers, that's where you start. Odette's heart raced at the revelation. Gabrielle wasn't just scheming for the house. She was involved in something far darker. Armed with this new information, Odette made a silent vow. She would uncover the truth and bring Gabrielle's deceit to light. Odette sat in the corner of the bustling shelter cafeteria, sipping a cup of tea as Simone slid into the seat across from her. The air smelled of warm bread and the faint tang of cleaning supplies. Despite the chatter around them, Simone's voice was low and deliberate. Etienne isn't just Gabrielle's confidant, Simone said, her eyes darting around the room. He's tied to something bigger, something criminal? Odette leaned closer, her chest tightening. What do you mean? Simone pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the table between them. I've been keeping tabs on him for a while. People in the community talk and his name comes up in all the wrong places. He's involved in trafficking. Odette's breath caught. Trafficking? Are you sure? Simone nodded, her expression grim. Human trafficking. Children specifically. He's part of a network. And if Gabrielle is meeting with him, she's not innocent in this. Odette stared at the folder, the weight of Simone's words settling over her like a shroud. The betrayal she felt when Gabrielle took her home was nothing compared to this. If Gabrielle was complicit in such horrors, Odette knew she had to act. Over the next few days, Odette and Simone worked together to gather more information. Simone introduced Odette to a small circle of community members who had been quietly collecting evidence against Etienne and his associates. Among them was Alain, a retired police officer turned volunteer, who had been tracking the network for months. "We've been trying to build a case," Alain explained as he spread out photos and documents on the table. "But Etienne is slippery. He's careful and his connections run deep." "What about Gabrielle?" Odette asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "How does she fit into this?" Alain hesitated. "We don't have solid proof yet, but we've seen her meeting with Etienne several times. If we can establish her involvement, it could blow the whole operation wide open." Odette clenched her fists. She had always known Gabrielle was manipulative, but this went beyond anything she could have imagined. She looked at Alain, her resolve clear. "What can I do to help?" That night, Odette sat in her small cot at the shelter, poring over the evidence Alain had given her. Photos of Gabrielle and Etienne in whispered conversations, financial records tied to shell companies, and blurred images of children being moved between locations. Each piece was a puzzle, painting a picture of something far darker than Odette could comprehend. Her thoughts drifted to Thomas. Did he know? Had he been pulled into Gabrielle's schemes, or was he as blind to her true nature as he appeared? Odette's heart ached at the thought of her son being caught in the crossfire. The next morning, Odette met with Alain and Simone at a nearby cafe. They discussed their next steps, their voices low as they mapped out their plan. Alain handed Odette a burner phone, his expression serious. "If you find anything concrete, call me immediately," he said. "And be careful. Etienne doesn't play games." Odette's first move was to return to the Belrose house. She knew Gabrielle would be out for most of the day, and Thomas would likely be at his office. The house felt cold and empty as Odette stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She headed straight for the office, her fingers trembling as she rifled through the desk drawers. She found a ledger tucked beneath a pile of old bills, its pages filled with handwritten entries. The numbers were staggering, and the notes referenced transactions that made Odette's stomach turn. She snapped photos of the pages with the burner phone, her heart racing. Just as she returned the ledger to its place, she heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Panic surged through her as she hurriedly closed the drawer and slipped out of the office. Gabrielle entered the house moments later, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Odette watched from the shadows, her breath shallow. Gabrielle paused in the entryway, glancing around suspiciously before heading into the kitchen. Odette slipped out the back door, her pulse pounding. She made her way to the shelter, where she handed the phone to Alain. He scanned the photos, his expression darkening with each image. "This is exactly what we needed," Alain said. "These transactions tie Etienne to Gabrielle, and to the network." Simone placed a reassuring hand on Odette's shoulder. "You've done more than we could have hoped for. Now it's time to let the police handle it." The following day, Alain contacted his connections in law enforcement. A task force was assembled, and plans for a raid on Etienne's property were set in motion. Odette felt a mix of relief and trepidation as she watched the pieces come together. On the morning of the raid, 12 officers gathered at the shelter for a final briefing. Odette stood among them, her presence a testament to her resilience. She had started this journey as a displaced grandmother, but now she was at the center of a mission to bring justice to those who couldn't fight for themselves. As the officers prepared to move out, Alain turned to Odette. "You've done something incredible. No matter what happens today, you've already made a difference." Odette nodded, her eyes glistening with determination. "Let's finish this." The sun rose over Etienne's sprawling estate, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and high fences. 12 police officers, armed and ready, positioned themselves around the property. Their movements were silent, their faces grim with purpose. Inside one of the unmarked vehicles parked discreetly down the road, Odette sat alongside Alain, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "This is it," Alain said, his voice steady. "If the intel is correct, we'll find everything we need to dismantle Etienne's operation." Odette nodded, her expression resolute. "And Gabrielle? If she's there, we'll take her in too." The plan was set. The officers would move in under the cover of the morning, aiming to catch Etienne and his associates off guard. As the signal was given, they moved swiftly, scaling fences and breaking through doors in a synchronized effort. The sound of boots echoed in the corridors as the raid began. Inside the house, Gabrielle stood in the kitchen, her morning coffee in hand. She turned at the sound of a commotion, her heart lurching as voices shouted from the front door. Etienne stormed into the room, his face twisted in panic. "They're here," he hissed, grabbing a bag from under the counter. "We need to go." Gabrielle froze, her mind racing. She had known Etienne was involved in something illicit, but the sight of armed police closing in shattered any illusion she had clung to. "What do you mean they're here?" Etienne didn't answer, his focus on the back exit. But before they could make their escape, the kitchen door burst open, and 2 officers entered, their weapons drawn. "Hands in the air," one of them barked. Gabrielle dropped her coffee, the porcelain shattering on the floor. Etienne hesitated for a fraction of a second before lunging toward the nearest officer. The struggle was brief and futile. Within moments he was subdued, his hands cuffed behind his back. Gabrielle stood motionless, her hands trembling. An officer stepped toward her, his voice firm. "Gabrielle Belrose, you're under arrest for your involvement in human trafficking." Her knees buckled and she sank to the floor, the weight of her actions crashing down on her. The life she had carefully curated was unraveling before her eyes. From the safety of the car, Odette watched as the officers led Gabrielle and Etienne out in handcuffs. Her breath hitched as she saw Gabrielle's face, pale and tear-streaked. For a moment she felt a pang of sadness, but it was quickly replaced by a deep sense of justice. "You did it," Simone said, her voice soft but filled with admiration. "This is because of you?" Odette shook her head. "It's because of all of us. Those children, they'll finally have a chance." Inside the estate, officers uncovered a hidden room filled with evidence. Ledgers, photographs, and lists of names that tied Etienne and his network to countless atrocities. Among the documents were records of transactions Gabrielle had facilitated, solidifying her role in the operation. As the officers worked, Odette and Alain entered the property. The sight of the hidden room brought tears to Odette's eyes. She thought of the children who had suffered because of Etienne's greed and Gabrielle's ambition. "This is enough to convict them both," Alain said, his voice grim. "They'll face justice." Odette nodded, her heart heavy but hopeful. For the first time in months she felt a glimmer of peace. That evening, back at the shelter, Odette sat with Simone, reflecting on the day's events. The raid had been a success, but the journey was far from over. Gabrielle and Etienne would face trial, and the evidence would need to hold up in court. "Do you think Thomas knew?" Simone asked gently. Odette hesitated. "I don't know. I'd like to believe he was blind to her true nature, but..." Her voice trailed off, and Simone placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "You did everything you could, Odette. Now it's up to the system." Odette nodded, her resolve firm. She had fought for the truth, and now it was time to see it through to the end. In the days that followed, news of the raid spread quickly. Gabrielle's arrest made headlines, and the community buzzed with shock and disbelief. At the Belrose house, Thomas sat alone, staring at the front page of the newspaper. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He thought of his mother, of the warnings he had ignored, and the betrayal he had refused to see. Picking up the phone, he dialed Odette's number. It rang twice before she answered. "Mother," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Odette's voice was calm but distant. "We'll talk, Thomas. But not now." As she hung up, Odette felt a pang of sadness for her son. He had been a victim of Gabrielle's manipulations, but his refusal to listen had cost them dearly. Rebuilding their relationship would take time, but she was willing to try. The courthouse buzzed with energy as reporters and onlookers gathered to catch a glimpse of Gabrielle and Etienne being escorted inside. The news of their arrests had captivated the community, and the trial was poised to reveal the full extent of their crimes. Odette, dressed in a simple yet dignified outfit, stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the police ushered the two into the building. "Do you think justice will truly be served?" Simone asked, standing beside her. Odette's gaze didn't waver. "It has to be." The courtroom was tense as the trial began. Alain and the other investigators presented their evidence with precision, each piece painting a damning picture of the trafficking network. The photographs, financial ledgers, and witness testimonies left no room for doubt. Gabrielle sat silently, her once confident demeanor replaced by a mask of stoic resignation. When it was Odette's turn to testify, she walked to the stand with her head held high. The prosecutor approached, his tone gentle but firm. "Madame Belrose, can you tell the court what led you to suspect Gabrielle's involvement in these crimes?" Odette recounted her story, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She described the suspicious behaviors, the documents she had uncovered, and the fateful day she partnered with Simone and Alain to expose the truth. Her words were met with murmurs from the gallery, and Gabrielle avoided her gaze. "And what motivated you to take these risks, knowing the danger involved?" the prosecutor asked. Odette's eyes flicked toward Gabrielle before she turned to the jury. "Because the innocent deserve a voice. Those children deserved better than the life that was stolen from them." Her testimony was a turning point in the trial, bolstering the prosecution's case and leaving Gabrielle's defense scrambling. In the days that followed, more witnesses came forward, further solidifying the charges against Gabrielle and Etienne. Among them was Thomas, who had finally mustered the courage to confront the truth. His voice cracked as he described how he had been blind to Gabrielle's manipulations, a revelation that drew quiet sobs from the gallery. "I trusted her," Thomas said, his eyes glistening. "But I see now that she used that trust to hurt others." Gabrielle's expression remained unreadable, but her clenched fists betrayed her frustration. Etienne, meanwhile, glared at the witnesses with contempt, his composure slipping as the case against him grew stronger. When the verdict was delivered, the courtroom fell silent. The judge's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "Gabrielle Belrose and Etienne Moreau, you are found guilty on all counts, including human trafficking, conspiracy, and financial fraud. You will each serve a sentence of no less than 30 years. A collective exhale swept through the room. Gabrielle slumped in her seat, her face pale, while Etienne's scowl deepened. For Odette, the moment was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind would take time to heal. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of supporters greeted Odette with applause and words of gratitude. Among them were parents of the rescued children, their tearful thanks a poignant reminder of what had been achieved. One woman approached Odette, clutching a photograph of a little boy. "Because of you, my son is safe. I don't know how to thank you." Odette smiled gently, her own eyes misting. "You don't need to thank me. Just love him and give him the life he deserves." Simone and Alain joined her, their expressions a mix of relief and pride. "You did it, Odette," Simone said. "You stood up to them and won." Odette shook her head. "We did it. None of this would have been possible without all of you." That evening, back at the shelter, Odette reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had lost her home, faced betrayal, and risked everything for the truth. Yet, despite the pain, she had rediscovered her own strength and the power of community. Thomas visited her the next day, his demeanor humble and remorseful. "Mother," he began, his voice trembling, "I can't undo what's happened, but I want to make things right." Odette studied him for a moment before nodding. "Making things right starts with listening, Thomas. Not just to me but to the people around you." He nodded, his expression earnest. "I'll do better. I promise." The story of Odette's courage and determination spread throughout the community, inspiring others to take a stand against injustice. She was offered a position on the board of a child protection organization, a role she accepted with humility and a renewed sense of purpose. As she stood before the gathered volunteers at her first meeting, Odette felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. "We may not be able to change the past," she said, her voice steady, "but we can shape the future. And it starts with us." The morning air was crisp as Odette walked through the gates of the Belrose family estate for the first time since her eviction. The house loomed before her, its grandeur muted by the events that had unfolded. Thomas stood at the door, his face lined with a mixture of guilt and relief. He stepped forward hesitantly as Odette approached. "Mother," he began, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Odette regarded him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice firm but gentle. "What's done is done, Thomas. The important thing is that we move forward and learn." Thomas nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "I'll make it right. I promise." Inside, the house felt different. It was quieter, emptier. Gabrielle's absence was palpable, her influence no longer casting a shadow over the family. Odette took a deep breath, memories of her late husband and their years of building this home flooding back to her. "I want you to have the house back," Thomas said, his voice filled with sincerity. "It was always yours." Odette shook her head. "The house isn't what matters, Thomas. What matters is the family we rebuild. Together." Thomas's shoulders sagged with relief. For the first time in months, a fragile but genuine connection was forming between mother and son. Over the next few weeks, Odette became a pillar of strength not only for her family but also for the community. Her work with the Child Protection Organization gained momentum, drawing attention from local and national advocates. The children rescued from Etienne's network were receiving care and support, their futures no longer shrouded in darkness. At one of the organization's meetings, Odette spoke to a room filled with volunteers and survivors. Her voice was steady, her presence commanding. This isn't just about justice. It's about ensuring no child is ever forgotten, no voice ever silenced. Together, we can build a world where innocence is protected, and evil has no place to hide. The room erupted in applause, the warmth of their support bolstering Odette's resolve. Meanwhile, Thomas began volunteering alongside Odette, determined to atone for his complacency. At first, the work was humbling, but it quickly became a source of purpose. He spent hours organizing donations, assisting with outreach programs, and listening to the stories of survivors. One evening, as they sat together over cups of tea, Thomas turned to Odette. "I don't know how you stayed so strong through all of this." Odette smiled faintly, her hands cradling her cup. "Strength isn't about never breaking, Thomas. It's about finding the will to rebuild when you do." He nodded, his respect for his mother deepening. "I'll never forget that." Gabrielle's trial and conviction remained a topic of conversation in the community, but for Odette, the focus had shifted to healing. The scars left behind by Gabrielle's betrayal were deep, but they served as reminders of what had been overcome. One afternoon, as Odette walked through the shelter where she had found refuge, she paused to speak with Simone. The two women had become close friends, their bond forged through shared purpose. "You've come so far," Simone said, her voice filled with pride. "I don't think I've ever seen someone face so much and come out stronger." Odette chuckled softly. "I've had help. From you, from Alan, from everyone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Simone smiled, squeezing her hand. "You believed in yourself more than you know." The day Odette returned to her own home for good, the sun shone brightly, casting a golden glow over the estate. Thomas was by her side, carrying boxes of her belongings. They worked together to restore the house, each gesture a small act of reconciliation. As they finished arranging the living room, Thomas turned to her. "Mother, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for it." Odette placed a hand on his cheek, her eyes soft. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving, Thomas. It's about choosing to move forward. And I choose us." That evening, as Odette sat on the porch watching the sunset, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The fight for justice had tested her in ways she never imagined, but it had also revealed her strength, her resilience, and the power of community. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. The Belrose estate buzzed with activity as friends, neighbors, and volunteers gathered to celebrate the reopening of the community center Odette had spearheaded. Children played on the freshly painted playground, and families mingled around tables laden with homemade treats. The laughter and chatter were a stark contrast to the silence and tension that had once enveloped Odette's world. Standing at the entrance, Odette greeted each guest with a warm smile. Beside her, Thomas handed out brochures about the center's mission, to provide a safe haven for children and families in need. The joy on his face was unmistakable, a testament to how far he had come. "You've done something extraordinary, Mother," Thomas said as the last guest arrived. "This place, it's hope." Odette's eyes glistened. "It's not just me, Thomas. It's everyone who believed we could make a difference." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Odette stood on the porch of the center, watching the sun set over the town. Simone joined her, a glass of lemonade in hand. "You've built something beautiful here," Simone said, her voice filled with admiration. Odette smiled. "It's not just about the building. It's about the people. The children, the volunteers, the families who now have a place to feel safe and supported." Simone nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "And it's about you, Odette. You've shown everyone what it means to fight for what's right." As the weeks passed, the community center flourished. Odette became a beloved figure in the town, her story inspiring others to stand against injustice. The children rescued from Etienne's network began attending programs at the center, their laughter a symbol of resilience and renewal. One afternoon, Odette sat with a young girl named Amélie, who had been among the rescued children. Amélie held a crayon in her hand, her brow furrowed in concentration as she drew on a sheet of paper. "What are you making, Amélie?" Odette asked gently. The girl looked up, her eyes bright. "A home," she said simply. "A big house with lots of windows so the light can always come in." Odette's heart swelled with emotion. "It's beautiful, Amélie. Just like you." Amélie beamed, her smile a ray of sunshine. Meanwhile, Thomas continued to rebuild his life, working closely with the center and forging connections he had never imagined. One evening, as he and Odette shared a quiet dinner, he turned to her, his voice filled with gratitude. "Mother, I don't know how I'll ever repay you," he said. "For everything, for believing in me even when I didn't deserve it." Odette reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "You don't need to repay me, Thomas. You've already done more than enough by choosing to be better. On the one-year anniversary of the center's opening, Odette gave a speech to a crowd of supporters. The event was held in the center's garden, where the flowers Thomas had planted were in full bloom. "This center is more than a building," Odette began, her voice steady and heartfelt. "It's a promise. A promise that we will never turn away from those in need. A promise that we will fight for justice and compassion, no matter the cost. And a promise that together we can create a brighter future." The crowd erupted in applause, and Odette felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was her purpose, her legacy, a testament to the power of resilience, love, and community. That evening, as the celebration wound down, Odette sat on her porch at the estate, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The stars above twinkled brightly, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the endless possibilities it held. Thomas joined her, a cup of tea in hand. "You've built something incredible, Mother," he said. "I'm proud of you." Odette smiled, her heart full. "And I'm proud of you, Thomas. For everything." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Odette felt a deep sense of peace. The battles she had fought, the losses she had endured, and the victories she had achieved had all led to this moment. A new dawn for her family, her community, and herself. And for the first time in years, Odette allowed herself to dream of the future, knowing it would be as bright as the stars above. What do you think about Odette's journey? Would you have handled things differently in her position? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the post and share it with others who might need a story of hope and resilience. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.